So welcome to our webinar today, and thank you very much for taking time to attend. And we're talking about supporting Indigenous initiatives and YCW applications, as you know. Before we begin, I really want to acknowledge that the CMA Secretariat is located on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And as a national organization, our work takes place in all territories across what's currently known as Canada, coast to coast to coast, and the territories of all Indigenous peoples. And we really want to acknowledge today the colonial legacy of museums and commit in the ways that we best can to recognizing and promoting Indigenous people's self-determination over their lands and culture through history and also today. Before I let you know exactly what we will be discussing, I'm just going to introduce myself and allow my YCW counterpart to introduce herself. So my name is Stephanie Daniluk. I'm the co-author of the Move to Action report, and also did the research and analysis for that report. Some the engagement work as well. Currently, my role is Senior Manager for Engagement and Indigenous Initiatives at the CMA, and I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 Territory, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I'll turn it over to Erica, let you introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm Erica, and I am a program officer, HO program officer with YCW CMA, and I've been with the CMA for about 1.5 years now, and I hope to help answer any YCW related questions.
Great. So today we'll be giving everyone a bit of an overview of the CMA Reconciliation Program, what's bringing us to talk to you today about this Move to Action report and, recommendations for considerations for YCW applications. We have some specific practical considerations for you, and then some supporting resources, and then lots of time for your questions. But Erica in the hot seat.
So the Canadian Heritage Department has given us priorities for applications. So the priorities that we were given are Indigenous employers for eligible projects, projects aimed at Indigenous participants from an Indigenous or non-Indigenous employer, projects focused on Indigenous cultural heritage, also could be from an Indigenous or non-Indigenous employer, and hiring youth that are part of an equity deserving group. And so this is the equity deserving groups. There's a list that is provided on the YCW website. And these priorities will be considered when we're screening the applications and the employers themselves, and when the peer committee is grading the applications.
Great. And if there's any questions, again, we'll have time to post those after. We wanted to let you know also a few possible prompts for questions at the end of the workshop. We would really like to hear from you in addition to any, YCW specific questions that Erica can take today or come back to you with later. What successes or obstacles are you encountering in your own work to incorporate Indigenous focused initiatives in your YCW programs and applications? What additional resources or supports do you need? And then, of course, any other questions that you may have. So keep these in mind as we go through the presentation. We'll be coming back to these at the end. So why is the CMA talking to you about this today? Well, as you probably know, the TRC named the CMA as the association to undertake call to action number 67. So they called upon the federal government to provide funding to the CMA to undertake in collaboration with Indigenous peoples national review of museum policies and best practices to determine the level of compliance with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. so UNDRIP, and to make recommendations, which we did, and that was all released at the end of September. And we did this with the leadership and guidance of these folks here who want to hold up as much as possible in their work to support and lead and advise the whole project from start to finish. And so those folks are listed here, the ones who were at the end, and the whole list of contributors on the council can be found in our acknowledgement section of the report. I note there's a Q&A comment that the chat is currently disabled. So Amelia, is that something you're able to manage on your end, or if not, let me know. I might need to hold on here. Okay, you should be able to, I think. Okay. So where did we get the information from that's in the report that, you know, informs the recommendations and standards that we have in there? We held a variety of listening circles and roundtables with Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast. We held one-on-one interviews with experts in the field and focusing on Indigenous experts. We solicited written submissions from the museum community, and as well as conducted a national survey that was very well responded to, and then conducted some KPI or key performance indicator research that focused on what we call promising institutions kind of across the nation. So these engagement sessions, all of the recordings, information was put into these graphic recordings to kind of anonymize the responses, but also make them publicly accessible. So you can find these all on our website. You can look at each session that was held and kind of give or receive a nice overview of the topics that were discussed and some of the main considerations from each of these sessions. So I encourage you to look at those if you have not had a chance. We also had some really great discussions and kind of workshops with small museums in particular. Did kind of a small museum workshop series, and then we had a small museums working group. And so kind of the output of or outcome of some of those discussions are in this really nice graphic recording that you can also visit on our website and take a look at in more detail. So the impetus behind the kind of the overall report in the end was to create a new national baseline or foster a new national baseline. A review of this kind really hadn't taken place for 30 years, so not since the 1992 Task Force Report on Museums that was done between the CMA and the AFN has like this level of kind of review and analysis happened. And so we took into consideration the recommendations of the 1992 report, and you kind of use that to evaluate, you know, where things stand today and where they need to go in accordance to what we heard from our engagement sessions. And we'll talk about some of those outputs today. And then, of course, used the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the lens through which to assess all of these things. And what we came up with was a set of standards for museums. So there are 30 recommended standards for museums in various topics, I guess. So, you know, covering repatriation, engagement, operations, and governance. And if you haven't had a chance to take a look at those, I really encourage you to all in the report. And then we also had 10 recommendations for sectoral work that needs to happen. The report kind of looks at 4 main sections: repatriation and collections, engagement and partnership, governance, and operations. And so what we will be talking through mainly for the rest of this workshop are the areas of governance and operations, hoping to have an engagement focused follow-up workshop once kind of YCW applications have been received and responses have gone out, in order to further reflect on considerations that you might want to have. So today, thinking through these major kind of areas, operations, governance, particularly thinking about job descriptions, recruitment, hiring strategies, and how this is part of your long-term planning. In those standards for museums, you'll find 3 very specific operational standards, and they are listed here for you. So 11, 12, and 13. 11 talks about development of hiring practices and policies that, really acknowledge and consider Indigenous knowledge and community relationships, outside of kind of Western-based knowledge systems and education systems. Number 12 talks about the incorporation into job descriptions of these like relevant ways of, to acknowledge Indigenous knowledge, skills, community partnerships, and relationships that I just talked about, and those types of things that are important for success in the roles. And then, of course, thinking through ways that all policies and operational practices and mandates need to support UNDRIP, need to support Indigenous peoples and staff in your museum. So what does that mean? When it comes to YCW applications, it means really being thoughtful about how you're framing the position and what kind of a candidate you're looking for in these roles. So some of this will involve work in areas of project development and description, but some of it will also involve thinking through museum governance and advisory, so some institutional learning and reflection in order to understand what steps the museum needs to take or the institution needs to take in order to properly support these positions and projects. And thinking, always long-term. So how is this part of a long-term strategy? And how does things like advisory, governance, and operations kind of all fold into this longer-term strategy and engagement? And, at the very beginning, thinking beyond tokenism, which we'll talk about in a little more right now. So, as part of the engagement for the Move to Action report, or the TRC Call to Action 67, we spent a lot of time speaking with Indigenous museum professionals, and we had Indigenous-led Spaces Working Group who really guided a lot of the standards and information that you see on the report, in this operations area particularly. And we heard a lot of examples where folks were hired in an Indigenous specific role or to support an Indigenous specific program, and were kind of left as kind of the sole staff responsible for decolonization, for maintaining community partnerships, often on top of the job that they were already being asked to do. And so just want to consider this, making sure that you're not tokenizing anyone who is kind of coming into your museum as part of like a YCW Indigenous-led project, and that everyone is responsible for decolonization and everyone is responsible for building and maintaining community partnerships for the long term. So, you're not just simply checking a box for eligibility that that Erica had talked to at the beginning, and that you're, thinking really deeply and deeply considering kind of these standards and going beyond tokenization. Erica, did you have some examples here? We had talked about maybe providing some.
Yeah, so the key thing is remembering that you're there to support the participant, and so you should be providing them with the resources that they require. So connections with the community, if that's something that they don't personally have. And so like a task that we don't consider eligible would be asking an Indigenous candidate to translate your materials, your programming, or your exhibits. We feel that this is not appropriate for a participant to be completing for an organization. And just because a position is an Indigenous position, like the project is Indigenous, doesn't mean the candidate will be Indigenous, doesn't mean that they'll be able to provide a translation service for you. That's what translators are for. So, yeah.
This is from one of our graphic recordings at our Haida Gwaii Museum engagement session. And I think it really nicely illustrates what we heard as through the engagement sessions, you know, the ways that Indigenous candidates or Indigenous museum professionals are often relied upon to kind of feed institutions information, and the ways that they, you know, have to put in all this time and energy and knowledge on top of, you know, their position, and ways that they spoke about this leading to real burnout. So, you know, making sure that, yeah, representation needs to be Indigenous driven, but it needs to happen in a way that compensates and recognizes and respects what the work entails. You know, compensating sometimes for you know, elder relationship building. What does that mean? Like, we've heard examples of folks like taking elders out to Valley Village. You know, if thinking about engagement and relationship building that goes beyond just like museum only, museum specific, and making sure that that's being compensated and considered as part of the position. I'll shift gears a bit and talk a little about, you know, museum governance and how it relates to, how does that relate to YCW applications? Well, it's part of this kind of longer term strategy, reevaluating operations and reevaluating advisory and how that involves Indigenous peoples in your museum. So making sure that, you know, any decolonizing initiatives in the museum are supported by planning and policy and proper advisory that's meaningful and in capacity building. So if you kind of visit our operations section in our report, we lay out some of that there, and as well as in our governance section of the report to talk quite a bit about this. That key performance indicator research that I gestured towards at the beginning of this presentation told us a lot about the state of Indigenous advisory and governance in museums right now, and really that it's kind of underdeveloped. So we heard in that survey, the national survey, we heard that 73% of museums who responded are engaging in some kind of Indigenous programming. So it could be, you know, engagement work with a community, exhibit, program, project, educational initiative, something like that. That's a big number, 73%. But only 10% have mandated operationalized policies, and only 10% have Indigenous advisory. So there's a gap there that needs to be filled. So when you're thinking about how this affects your museum long-term, how to kind of decolonize your governance and operations, it really does begin with a critical assessment of where you're at as an institution, thinking through, you know, what learning needs to happen, maybe on your board, or maybe among leadership, or maybe among your staff. Are there systemic barriers in your organization and that you may not even be aware of that are kind of inhibiting Indigenous professionals from doing their job in your organization? Or, like I said before, are you asking for additional responsibilities? Are you relying on your Indigenous candidates to maintain community relationships or partnerships? Or are you even just, relying on non-Indigenous candidates to create and maintain partnerships? Because that's something else that we heard, that often when that does happen, that those relationships kind of disappear when the YCW candidate is no longer with the organization. So how are you investing long-term? So what supports are in place within your museum to identify implicit bias and systemic racism? And if you don't know, who can you talk to find out? Which is kind of not always easy, but if you can kind of look outside to additional resources and supports, there's quite a few out there, and we'll speak to some at the end and probably provide more following this webinar. So you've evaluated your museum for readiness and you're ready to go. You want to make sure now who is responsible for implementing UNDRIP? Who is responsible for supporting Indigenous self-determination in your museum? The answer is everyone. So implementing UNDRIP in your museum requires, thinking through labor and hiring practices in all staff positions, not simply those meant for Indigenous candidates. We pulled some examples of ways that this has been brought into job descriptions, and not saying that this is a perfect example, but this one comes from the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. And in their job description responsibilities, they have added this language that, this position will contribute to a culture that promotes respect, equity, inclusion, innovation, and models anti-racist and accountable behaviors. Of course, it's not enough to put this in there. There needs to be supports and accountabilities, worked into the actual operations of the museum, but just wanted to provide a quick example for ways that this is being reflected in some institutions. Some others that we found in qualifications sections of job postings. So the City of Kingston had this language, so that the candidate will demonstrate knowledge of and ability to work with diverse populations, including ethno-cultural and Indigenous communities, as well as underserved communities. So again, not saying this is perfect, but an example for you. And then another that we drafted on our own, some language that says, this candidate will have a demonstrated knowledge of UNDRIP, truth and reconciliation calls to action, as well as other principles and approaches to working with Indigenous communities. Can someone just give me a time check? I cannot see what time it is on my computer, and I feel...
It's 2:25.
Thank you. Okay. Spoke a bit about this at the outset, but what does it mean, to deprioritize education models, particularly within grant applications, which often have, some pretty prescriptive methods of having to have those filled out. So how can you indicate that, Indigenous knowledge, cultural knowledge will be prioritized in the same way or perhaps more than academic credentials? And, in the report and the standards, we recommend incorporating into job descriptions the relevant ways that Indigenous knowledge, skills, and perspectives are important for success in the role. Erica, did you want to add a little bit to this when it came to
So I was going to speak to the fact that YCW has some pretty clear criteria regarding education. So heritage organization or the summer or student positions the student needs to be returning to school. And for the BCH positions, the candidate needs to be a graduate of a college or university program. And if you have any questions about this, you should be contacting your program officer. And they'll be able to answer any questions you have about the education of a candidate, sorry.
So acknowledging that YCW needs to decolonize a little bit, and that that's obviously not going to happen immediately, but if you have questions, yeah. Did I summarize that okay for you? Okay. So now we'll turn to some kind of specific ways that we can apply, UNDRIP in labor and hiring practices. Some things that we've heard from folks who we interviewed or did engagement sessions with. So speak a little bit about expanding job descriptions, some considerations for recruitment, as well as these additional considerations here. So first, the first thing you should do is to make sure that your job description isn't just simply adding the word Indigenous in the job title, but that you're really thinking through the specifics and the specific kind of cultural knowledge and community and kind of like competencies and project areas that you want the candidate to be contributing to. So really like valuing Indigenous knowledge and community relationships in a way that's as specific as possible, and reflecting that in the job description in a way that goes beyond to just adding them as additional competencies, which you see quite a bit. I've done a lot of reviewing of job descriptions out there, and it's often kind of an add-on at the end, Indigenous knowledge, or knowledge of the Dakota language would be an asset, something like that. So thinking about ways that you can weave this in throughout your job description and project description. Erica, anything to add on this one?
I don't think I had something here, but
I think it's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah.
Okay. So what this kind of looks like in practice, and we do have a forthcoming toolkit that has some specific kind of examples and templates for considerations for this. But really being specific, as I say, about the type of qualifications you're looking for. So is it knowledge from a traditional community? Is it specific community connections, capacity to maintain long-term relationships, or those relationships that might exist already that you want to, kind of seek to build on in your own institution? Specific language skills for translation or whatever, or, knowledge of Indigenous approaches to museology. So there's just a few there. Some considerations to recruitment. So this really requires going beyond your traditional networks that you are advertising to or pulling from. So as much as possible, notifying the communities who you think you could find candidates within, connecting to those communities, sending them job postings, posting to social media platforms is a big one, emailing it to as many or sharing it with as many contacts in your network as possible, as well as local Indigenous governments or local Indigenous organizations, so that it's getting out to as many potential candidates as you possibly can. And then I'm also going to share some Indigenous specific job boards that you can consider posting to. And just note that the YCW travel policy can assist here. I'm turning it to Erica to talk more about this.
Yeah, so the YCW travel policy is for candidates who are going to be traveling from their home to a different location. So it has to be within 125 kilometers. Sorry, over 125 kilometers. And it has to be the cheapest option available. So that would be potentially buses, depending on if that's available. Some places only plane travel is available. Some places you have to travel by your personal vehicle. And it has to be from your home base, wherever you're currently located, to another the work site, not a commute. Daily commutes aren't eligible for this funding. And if the travel is conducted through a personal vehicle, the reimbursement will cover based off of, just trying to remember from my notes. The reimbursement is based off of the current cents by kilometer rate from the National Joint Council. So there's a link that will be sent out in the documents when it's indicated that a candidate might be traveling. So there is also potential for coverage for overnight accommodations if public transport, it takes more than 9 consecutive hours on the first day of travel, and just a personal vehicle exceeds 650 kilometers on the first day. And it has to be reasonable accommodations. All the receipts have to be kept for reimbursement. And if you have questions about the travel policy, it's something you should be discussing with your program officer, because they can help with that as well.
If you haven't seen these before, here's a short list of possible Indigenous job boards you can post to. So Indigenous Careers, Nation Talk Job Board, Win Speaker. And then AMMSA.com has links to regional job boards you can post to. So it's worth taking a look at those to see if your region is represented. And then, Facebook and Instagram groups. Additional questions to kind of think through as you're, adopting or crafting an Indigenous kind of initiative. So if you do hire an Indigenous person for their cultural competencies, how will they be supported in the workplace? So, sometimes this means summer season can be ceremony season. For some nations, what are you going to do? How flexible can you be in providing time for participation in cultural ceremony? From what I understand, there's some flexibility within YCW that you can even consider this sometimes part of the museum project. So, questions to ask there. If your candidate does experience either tokenization or implicit bias or racism within your museum, what processes do you have? What strategies are in place to address this in a way that takes accountability, making sure that those are, communicated at the outset. And then we've said this already, but, reconciliation, diversity and inclusion and anti-racism work really does need to be championed by non-Indigenous leadership in an organization. So thinking through who's responsible, who's leading this work in your institution. So in supporting, Indigenous-centered projects, how are you supporting this project with a long-term engagement strategy? So this includes plans for funding, Making sure, as we said, that any community relationship building goes beyond the candidate, but is continued on by the museum. And, you know, really thinking through that ahead of time. How will the museum ensure all relationships built can be maintained long-term? I spoke to that already. So through governance, through operations, through engagement, not just through engagement. It needs to happen at all levels across the board. And, you know, just being pretty, just reiterating, you know, just because the YCW funds are short-term, the contracts are short-term, this doesn't mean that YCW employees can't be part of a longer-term strategy. So, you know, you're bringing someone in just for the summer, but, you know, over 5 years, what does that mean? What are they contributing to? What are your long-term strategies there? You know, repeating, how is this project led by meaningful Indigenous governance and advisory? And by meaningful, we mean that there's input at the outset, not just kind of a sign off at the end. And how is capacity being invested in Indigenous communities? There's various ways that can be thought through. So we have some resources and supports that are forthcoming, and they're late. But you can look for these soon. Small Museums Handbook will be the last to arrive, but I'd look for that the next month. In the next week or so, we will be releasing these 2 quick reference guides, one on repatriation and collections management called More Than Giving Back, and another entitled Becoming Better Employers. And all the examples and kind of things I spoke to at the latter half of this presentation will be in that specific toolkit. So with like templates and other kind of examples, more examples. So encourage you to take a look at that once it's ready. Then we also have some self-facilitated kind of sessions. One that will help you think through that longer term engagement strategy that I've been talking about. Another that will help think through ways to incorporate UNDRIP through whole of museum operations and in all positions. And then another that kind of takes a look at reassessing or assessing governance and kind of addressing or articulating, I guess, areas of learning that need to take place and to really help the institution implement UNDRIP in a meaningful way. Yeah, with a geared kind of outcome towards strategic planning. Okay, that's all for me. Now we can turn it over to you. If you have any questions, you can put them in Q&A, or if you raise your hand, do I see it? Do you know? I'm not so familiar with the webinar function. Aha, yes. Lorenda, I'm going to enable your talk function and you can go for it.
Hi, my name is Lorenda Calvert, pronouns she, her. I'm with the BC Museums Association. I just wanted to mention that your chat is still disabled. I encountered this with a webinar yesterday. If you wanted to enable it, if you want to be able to type the questions, when you open the chat, there should be like 3 small little dots in the corner. If you click on that, that's where you can go through the menu to enable it to all webinar participants.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's Suzanne, I think, next. I'm going to. Sorry, I'm trying to. Yeah. Oh, there we go. We have someone in the Q&A, so I'm assuming we're okay. So Q&A function. Use the Q&A function. Okay, Suzanne Peterson, you had your hand up. Did you have a question? And if not, if you want to go now, and if not, I'll take one of these Q&As in the Q&A, one of the questions in the Q&A section. Resources to help you be a better employer. Asking if there's a CME Indigenous resource bank. No, the quick answer to that is no, there isn't. For a variety of reasons. One of the recommendations in the report that we released focuses around network building, and that's something that is part of the CMA's longer term strategy. So we'll be kind of working with the proper folks in those areas to develop additional networking resources and that kind of thing. So more to come. And Carol's asking if the PowerPoint will be available after the session. Yes, it will. We'll be sending it out to all participants. Is that typically what you do, Erica?
We normally have it uploaded on our YouTube channel, which is linked on our CMA resources page.
Hi, Stephanie, Erica, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that the chat's still disabled for me.
Yeah,
so
okay. I'm struggling with the chat right now, but if you can.
Oh, the Q&A. Yeah, the Q&A works.
Yeah.
I see it. Thank you. That's it. Yeah.
Okay.
And thanks for the information about the publications. That's great.
Yes. Okay. I may have fixed the chat thing. So somebody test it out. And we can run both. Yes, we're good. Okay. Any more questions, comments? Someone want to put Erica on the hot seat?
Yes, the deadline is tomorrow.
Okay, last call for questions, I guess. Specific time for the deadline.
End of day. Yeah. There's no specific timeline.
So if someone wants to burn the midnight oil. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate the comment that the session came in a little late. We had to postpone due to some very unforeseen circumstances, and so you know, hoping that this will kind of help further down the line, you know, even considerations for job descriptions and things as you go. And again, looking for one more specific on engagement and kind of project building, I guess, soon.
And we're hoping to build off of this experience as well for future presentations. So.
Okay. Well, thank you. If leave it open for some late questions to come in, and in the meantime, I'll just say appreciate your time. If you have questions for YCW or for the reconciliation program, please contact us at either of these emails. Seeing no further questions, we can call it a wrap. What do you think, Erica? Okay. Yeah, so any questions, email us. If not, have a good one, and we'll see you next time. Bye.